They weren't rebels, they weren't gangs, and they didn't wear uniforms. Yet every night, people vanished. By morning, corpses were found lining train tracks, riddled with bullets. Entire families were massacred in their homes, with no warning, no survivors. And while the world celebrated a nation's path to democracy, someone was staging mass killings designed to look like tribal warfare. The murderers wore masks. Some carried military-grade rifles, some carried machetes. All carried out the same mission: make it look like chaos, make it look like black-on-black violence. But behind the bloodshed, there were whispers that the killers were trained, funded, protected. South Africa's dream of freedom was under siege, not from foreign enemies, but from within its system. Who unleashed the terror that nearly collapsed one of history's most celebrated democratic transitions? And why was no one ever truly held responsible? Between 1990 and 1994, South Africa stood at the edge of monumental change. A nation long defined by apartheid was finally inching toward democracy. Political prisoners were being freed, liberation movements were unbanned, and for the first time in history, the possibility of one person, one vote felt within reach. But while the cameras focused on handshakes and negotiations, something far more sinister was unfolding behind the scenes. A wave of violence erupted across the country. Townships burned. Commuter trains turned into killing grounds. Political rallies ended in bloodbaths. The official story: rival factions are fighting for dominance. Ethnic tensions, tribal revenge, random unrest. But too many details didn't add up. Killers arrived in coordinated formations. Eyewitnesses reported seeing military vehicles drop off attackers. Weapons used in the massacres were often traced back to the state, and yet no one in power took responsibility. The term "third force" entered the public conversation. A vague label slapped on what many believed was a covert campaign to destabilize the transition and keep the apartheid regime's influence intact. This wasn't just sabotage, it was psychological warfare. The story we're about to uncover isn't one of spontaneous civil unrest. It's a story of systematic terror, planned, funded, and executed with military precision by forces loyal to a dying regime. Over the next several minutes, we'll dive into the disturbing operations that nearly tore South Africa apart. Covert death squads, false flag massacres, propaganda campaigns, and a political assassination that nearly plunged the country into civil war. Because the truth is, freedom was never freely given. It had to be taken through blood, betrayal, and the silent war no one was supposed to talk about. To understand how South Africa's transition to democracy was nearly destroyed from within, we have to go back decades before Nelson Mandela walked free. In the 1980s, under the leadership of P.W. Botha, the apartheid government implemented a doctrine called total strategy. It was more than a military plan. It was a mindset. South Africa, officials claimed, was under siege by a total onslaught from communists and black liberation groups. And they would fight fire with fire. This justification blurred the lines between national security and outright terror. The state created an expansive security apparatus. Units like the Security Branch, Special Forces, and military intelligence developed tactics rooted in assassination, torture, and psychological warfare. Their job wasn't just to fight enemies, it was to break them, discredit them, and if necessary, kill them. By the end of the decade, apartheid was collapsing under internal pressure and global outrage. But the security networks it built? They didn't vanish. They simply adapted. On February 11, 1990, Nelson Mandela walked free after 27 years in prison. The moment was historic, but for many inside South Africa's military and police, it was viewed as a betrayal. They had spent their careers fighting the ANC, and now the enemy was being welcomed into government. That same year, political violence exploded. More than 14,000 people were killed between 1990 and 1994, more than during the entire previous decade of the anti-apartheid struggle. Most of the killings were blamed on the conflict between ANC and Inkatha Freedom Party supporters. But soon, patterns emerged. Eerie, methodical patterns. Victims were often targeted with military-style tactics. Police arrived late, or not at all. And in many cases, the attackers seemed trained, not spontaneous. Journalists and human rights groups began asking, who was orchestrating this? The answer would come to be known as the third force, a term used to describe a shadowy alliance of death squads, paramilitary groups, and rogue elements within the police and military. Between 1990 and 1993, South Africa's commuter trains became killing grounds. 532 people were murdered in over 600 separate incidents. 572 people were murdered in over 600 separate incidents. Masked gunmen would board packed trains, open fire with automatic rifles, and vanish without a trace. The public was told this was tribal warfare, but the violence was too consistent, too organized. The Goldstone Commission, tasked with investigating the bloodshed, initially found no clear evidence of state involvement, but that changed in 1992. A classified report, the Steen Report, revealed that elements within military intelligence, working with railway police, had coordinated many of the train attacks. The killers? Often Askaris, former ANC fighters who had been turned during interrogation and were now being used as tools of state terror. The purpose wasn't just to kill. It was to inflame tensions, make the country ungovernable, force a return to strongman rule. On the night of June 17, 1992, a group of roughly 300 armed men stormed the Joe Slovo settlement in Boipatong. They moved quickly, methodically, stabbing, shooting, and hacking residents to death. 45 people, including women and children, were killed. The attackers came from the nearby Kwamadala hostel, known to house IFP-aligned militants. But survivors reported seeing white men with painted faces, military vehicles, and police escorts. When the massacre reached the news, it caused global outrage. Mandela and the ANC walked out of negotiations. He publicly accused a clerk of having blood on his hands. For a moment, it looked like the entire peace process would collapse. But in court, the story unraveled. Over 120 witnesses testified, yet not one could confirm seeing security forces directly involved. Still, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission later concluded the attack was coordinated with state involvement. Boipatong showed how effective the Third Force's tactics were: cause chaos, create confusion, and fracture trust at the highest level. Vlakplaas, the farm of death, just 20 kilometers outside Pretoria, hidden among the hills, was a farm called Vlakplaas. To outsiders, it looked like a rehabilitation center for former guerrillas. In truth, it was the beating heart of the apartheid regime's death machine. Run by Colonel Eugene de Kock, nicknamed Prime Evil, Vlakplaas trained and deployed hit squads. Victims were interrogated, tortured, and executed on site. Sometimes their bodies were burned in chemical drums to erase evidence. One former operative described Vlakplaas as a factory of death. It wasn't just a site of violence, it was an institution. By 1990, it had grown into 9 squads, each carrying out covert killings, sabotage, and disinformation campaigns. De Kock would later confess to over 100 murders, and during the 1990s, his team supplied weapons to IFP fighters, ensuring the violence in the townships never stopped. By 1993, the transition was fragile. One man, Chris Hani, was seen as a future leader of the new South Africa, charismatic, militant, and hugely popular among the youth. On April 10, 1993, Hani was gunned down in front of his home. The shooter was Janusz Walusz, a Polish immigrant with far-right ties. His handler, Clive Derby Lewis, a Conservative Party MP. The government insisted this was the work of extremists acting alone. But behind the scenes, intelligence reports pointed to something deeper. A network of 20 individuals was identified, including members of military intelligence, the CCB, and international intelligence assets. Wallosh had long-standing ties with covert operatives. The goal? Start a civil war. Only Mandela's swift, televised appeal for calm prevented mass retaliation. But the third force had come seconds away from tipping South Africa into full-scale chaos. In late 1992, after a series of high-profile attacks, President F.W. de Klerk was forced to act. He commissioned General Pierre Steyn to investigate the military's covert units. What Steyn found was damning. Operations involving drug trafficking, illegal weapons smuggling, false flag attacks. A secret program called Operation Pasteur, designed to destabilize the ANC. The Steyn report named top generals and exposed a rot that reached the upper echelons of the SADF. But instead of prosecution, de Klerk forced 23 officers into early retirement, including some of the very generals who had helped decide who should be investigated. It was the clearest signal yet. The truth would be buried. The war that was never official. By 1994, the killing had slowed. South Africa held its first democratic elections. Nelson Mandela became president. And to the world, it seemed like the nightmare was over. But inside the new government, and among victims' families, a bitter truth remained. The architects of the terror had not faced justice. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, confirmed the existence of networks of ex-security force operatives acting in concert with right-wing extremists and Inkatha militants. It found evidence of systematic killings, disinformation, and covert sabotage. But the TRC stopped short of labeling the third force as an official government entity. Too many records had been destroyed. Too many operatives had vanished. And too many high-ranking officials hid behind claims of rogue elements. Only one senior figure, Eugene de Kock, went to prison. The rest? They disappeared into civilian life. Some entered private security, some went into politics, some remained ghosts in the system. And still, questions remain. Who ordered the train massacres? How deep was international intelligence involved? Why did President de Klerk consult with the very generals he was supposed to investigate? And what secrets were buried when those records were burned in 1992? The term third force was never clearly defined. That was the point. It created just enough ambiguity to allow the state to deny and the world to move on. But for those who lived through it, who watched their neighbors die, who saw killers escorted by uniformed police, who buried loved ones while newspapers blamed tribalism, the war was never unofficial. It was precise, it was planned, and it nearly succeeded. In the end, the bullet that missed South Africa wasn't fired, but it was loaded, cocked, aimed. And to this day, no one can say exactly who was holding the gun. South Africa's peaceful transition is often hailed as a miracle, and in many ways it was. A nation on the brink of civil war chose ballots over bullets, but miracles don't erase history. They don't erase the screams on a midnight train. They don't erase the mothers who found their children's bodies hacked apart. They don't erase the truth that democracy came at a price, and much of that price is still unpaid. The story of the Third Force is not just about a hidden war. It's about how power defends itself, silently, violently, and without apology, and how truth can be buried just deep enough to escape justice, but never deep enough to escape memory. So we ask you, was this the work of rogue elements, or a state-sanctioned operation with deliberate deniability? Was justice ever truly served? Or did South Africa trade one illusion of control for another? Let us know what you think in the comments. If this story moved you, if it made you think twice about how history is written and who gets to write it, consider subscribing. We explore the stories that were meant to stay buried, and the truths powerful people hoped you'd never hear. Because sometimes understanding the past is the only way to protect the future.